Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is Monday, May the 11th, 2020. I'm Keir Murray. I'm a Houston-based political and public affairs consultant. I'm joined by my dad, Dr. Richard Murray, political scientist from the University of Houston, for our sixth installment. Hard to believe. We've now done this will be a half dozen of these. Discussion of politics in the age of COVID-19. As we stand today, we've got a little over 4 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 worldwide, about 283,000 deaths, tragically, here in the United States. About 1.33 million cases confirmed, around 80,000 fatalities here. And in the state of Texas now, we're at about 40,000 diagnosed cases and about 1,100 fatalities. We've not been as hard hit as certainly the New York, New Jersey area and some other parts of the country, but our numbers are sadly beginning to creep up. Dad, just wanted to take a moment for you to sort of take stock of where we are generally as we're now moving into mid-May.
Yeah, I think it's pretty depressing what we're hearing on the healthcare front. Obviously, we're not specialists, we're just consumers of information about the crisis. But this virus looks like it's very persistent. There's no reason to hope for any kind of miracle cures at this point. We've got a huge rush to try to develop a vaccine, but most professionals think next year's probably the window when maybe that happens. So we may be doing a lot more of these podcasts because the virus isn't going anywhere. It's here. It's going to stay here. It's going to continue to enormously distort our lives, our economy, and almost entirely, unless you're a delivery company, in very bad ways.
And of course, on Friday we got the April jobs and unemployment report, which was nothing short of devastating. 20 million jobs lost in the month of April. Official unemployment rate of 15%, nearly. In reality, probably higher than that. But just staggering economic news. And as you say, there's no immediate indicator that things are going to improve. Turning to the president, one of the things we've seen over the last week or so, it looks to me like as the administration begin to wind down its front and center role in the public health side of this crisis. There was word that the president has plans to wind down the task force, for example, that we're familiar with, leaving things like testing largely to states and trying to reduce the federal government's presence, at least in the eyes of the American public, and turn more to the economic reopening of the country. How do you see that dynamic?
Well, I can understand what the administration is trying to do, but unlike Donald Trump's previous adversaries, be it former wives or girlfriends, business folks, political opponents, this virus doesn't pay any attention to public relations issues. And that's something that the president and his campaign team are going to realize they can't control this narrative. And of course, this week, suddenly the virus is in the White House.
What happened?
Right. I wanted to mention that we got word over the last day or two that I think now 3 senior members of the administration, people close to the president, including a naval officer who's one of his personal valets, an aide to Vice President Pence, who also happens to be married to Stephen Miller, who's one of the president's close advisors, have been diagnosed as COVID positive. We've seen some members of the administration are now self-quarantining, including Dr. Anthony Fauci and others, because they participated in these meetings over the last couple of weeks where people turned out to be positive. So it seems to me that, at a time when the administration's trying to communicate to the public directly and indirectly that, the worst of this crisis medically is over, it's, when you've got this thing apparently raging inside the White House itself, makes it difficult to do that, it seems to me.
Here, do you see on the screen? We have somebody's homepage,
Yeah.
and
Hang on.
Dick's not on video, so
Yeah, go ahead and answer though, and I'll play with this.
okay.
Yeah,
Sorry,
well,
people. Okay.
you know, the White House, despite looking like a big building, the offices themselves, the executive offices, are quite cramped. So it's not a very good environment to be going to work in person. And so there's a real risk at working in this particular work site. And, you know, Congress is still largely, you know, the House anyway, staying at home. And it's just another one of the many examples of how this virus has disrupted life across the spectrum, including now inside the White House and inside Capitol Hill.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, there were some stories over the weekend, including one in the Washington Post, pretty extensive story about the GOP increasingly being concerned that the political fallout of this may cost them their majority in the Senate, in addition to potentially losing the presidency and, you know, having virtually little chance now, it seems, of taking the House back that they lost in 2018. Not just, you know, the Democrats need to net 3 seats, I think, to take back the House. There's a pretty widespread assumption that the Alabama seat that the Democrats won in a special election is pretty likely to flip back to the Republicans, barring something unusual happening, so that, you know, you'd need to gain 4 seats to offset that probable loss. You know, states like Maine, Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina have been front and center in the battle for some time, but it seems now that other states are coming into play, potentially Georgia, where there are 2 seats in play, Iowa, which had been thought to be moving more in the Republican direction, Montana, a state that Trump won by 20 points in 2016, where shows that he's only leading by 5 or 6 now, and that the popular Democratic governor who's running for a Senate seat there may have a small lead in that race. And even states potentially like Texas that doesn't get a lot of airtime in this consideration, but you know, seems to me there's no reason we would be not be part of that conversation. What do you think about the way the Senate prospects are shaping up?
Well, it looks like to me this is going to be a national election. And so the kind of usual line about politics is local and that, you know, senators can run on their own record, and not so true in 2020. You've got a national crisis that doesn't respect state boundaries. You've got an incredibly dominant and visible president who monopolizes much of the political space. And the Republicans thought they were in good shape. They had a lot of seats up, about 25 seats, only 9 Democratic seats up. But all but 2 of those were in states Trump won. So the general feeling going into this was it'd be a long shot for the Democrats to get a Senate majority. Now, a lot of folks think it's more than 50-50 because Trump's troubles are spilling over into a lot of these red states that he won, but not by that large a margin, like Arizona or Georgia. And typically what happens in a nationalized race is a whole bunch of seats swing, not just 1 or 2. And it looks like to me that's what we're facing in 220. And the Republican political consultants are understandably quite worried.
Yeah, and I haven't had a chance to read the article yet, but I think New York Magazine has a new piece up today talking about, you know, if Biden were to win, that he views this as an FDR style presidency, right? Where thinking big, as FDR did during the Great Depression, large public works, public spending, that kind of thing. And it would seem to me that, just given the political realities of the day, that having a majority in the Senate as well as the House would probably be crucial to being able to enact any kind of large scale, you know, plans to move the country forward.
Absolutely, because the parties are so polarized that counting on getting any vote from the other party to enact significant legislation is pretty much a fantasy nowadays. Barack Obama really worked hard in 2009 on senators from Maine, for example. Got 3 votes, I think, for the stimulus. No votes on the healthcare plan. So a couple of things to note. If the Democrats get a majority in the Senate, it will probably be way, way short of 60 votes, which is the usual rule to bring up non-judicial business. So the Democrats will probably get rid of the filibuster on legislation, citing the Republican example of stripping it and confirming Supreme Court nominees. Because if you're going to have a big agenda to enact, you can't do it under present Senate rules.
Yeah, and it would seem to me that a big part of that agenda would be aid to states and local governments, right, which are going to being financially devastated by lost revenue, a problem that's only likely to get more acute in the coming months. As I mentioned before, some of this balking that we're seeing among conservatives about spending, the deficit, what these big stimulus programs may mean financially for the country, seems to me may also, in addition to putting them at odds with national Democrats, are going to potentially create tension among state and local governments, some of which are controlled by other Republican elected officials, because my sense is that these other governments, state and local, are going to be desperate for assistance that only the federal government can provide. And so how do you see that dynamic potentially shaping up, whether, A, before the election and whether we know Biden or Trump has won, and B, potentially afterwards, if Trump stays or if it's Biden instead?
Well, I think the Republicans in the Senate are going to be in a very tough position as more and more states and local governments are signaling we can't operate at anywhere near our present capacity unless we get help, and help not after the election in 2020, but help here in the late summer and fall. School districts have to all, get their budgets together, personnel decisions. Most local governments can't fund anywhere near the level of public safety that they're currently supporting. And I just don't think the Republican senators at the end of the day can stand by when your cities and counties and state governments are laying off firefighters and police officers. So there's going to be, I think, another big stimulus bill aimed particularly at state and local governments, because that's going to have a lot of bipartisan support in even red states like Alabama. They can't shut down their school system. So there's a lot of talk by people like Lindsey Graham, let's pause on this, let's not do this, but that's not going to happen. It seems to be in the end. We'll pass another major stimulus bill this year with a lot of help in it for state and local governments, including Texas.
And, you mentioned the school system, and, you and I had talked offline about how much of a key what happens with the schools is nationally to our where we are in this recovery. Talk about that a little bit, about where and when and how the schools reopen is so important as we try to move forward from this.
A lot of this reopening America, reopening the states, a lot of that's political posturing. I mean, you can change the rules, but if consumers don't want to go out and buy, and companies are not interested in calling their employees back, like Facebook is indicating you can work at home. But the schools, that's where political decisions have a direct and immediate impact. We got 50+ million students in public and private schools. They either go back to in-person instruction in August, September, or they don't. And that's a political decision. And that's not theater, and it has enormous implications. But millions of parents that need to know whether their kids are going to still be at home in the fall, or they're going to be in the local schools, or the school's going to be safe. You can't open a school at 25% capacity the way you can a restaurant. So, it's going to be a real world test. We know it's coming. It's coming in August. And certainly I think the schools are going to try to reopen. But with this virus persisting, none of us knows, what's going to happen when a lot of young kids that aren't going to observe social distance very well are suddenly back in the environments that they were forced out of in March.
Yeah. And again, as a parent of 2 school-age children, this is, I know, something that weighs on our minds a lot in our household, and I'm sure we're far from unique in that regard. But as you say, it's not just what happens to the kids themselves and the employees of those school districts, but for parents you know, you have to know, you have to have predictability about where your kids are going to be during the day with regard to your own employment. And what you can do, you have to know if they're going to be at school or they're not. And again, I think the clock is ticking. We're going to have to know something, you know, relatively soon in the coming weeks, I would think. So families can start to prepare for the fall, you know, which is coming up in just a few months. You know, we talked about this reopening as political theater, and I wanted to use that as an opportunity to shift closer to home here in Texas. As we've seen, there have been some protests around the country of folks maybe kind of aligned with the Tea Party type crowd that are clamoring for a more rapid reopening, balking at social distancing and being asked to wear masks and things like that, even by private businesses, who I think are, you know, can do whatever they see fit in that regard. But I'm wondering, you know, we had the interesting case in Texas of Shelley Luther, a Dallas County salon owner who decided to defy orders and open her business before things had been officially reopened. She was hauled into court in Dallas County, was asked by the judge to simply apologize and not open. She refused to do that, was held in contempt of court, was jailed for a couple of days. Folks on the political right in the state rallied to her cause, you know, making her a martyr for freedom, et cetera. As it turned out, there was a GoFundMe effort to pay for her legal bills that collected $500,000 before she ever decided to reopen, which calls into the question whether this was a real grassroots effort or what we call astroturfing in the political business, and put the governor in a difficult spot. You know, he had initially issued this order about keeping things closed, that she later defied, then tried to run to her side and, you know, was claimed to be outraged that she was jailed by a judge who was enforcing his order. So what do you make of the kind of political theater how it's playing out in Texas with regard to reopening the state?
Well, I think Abbott's in a tough spot, even though it's apparently a significant minority of Texans that are red hot to reopen whatever the health consequences. That's by no anywhere near a majority. Abbott's not on the ballot this year, like most governors. He's not up, but a lot of Republicans are, and in the general election this year figures to be much closer than any time in the last half-quarter century. Texas hasn't really been competitive since 1994, but this cycle, Democrats matter.
Yeah, and you know, I wanted to, part of what we're thinking about in the election as it pertains to November, not just in Texas, but across the country, is, as we've talked about before, is mail ballot voting, how that will be used or not used in this election. Emily Bazelon, who's a well-regarded legal reporter, wrote a lengthy piece in the New York Times Magazine talking about this problem nationally and citing some of the problems they had in Wisconsin in their recent primary and what those might mean nationally for the future. You know, here in Texas, of course, we've had a state district court judge rule that you know, any voter who believes he or she might be compromised by COVID-19 is qualified to vote by mail. It constitutes a disability. The Attorney General disagrees. He's back in court today trying to assert that that does not constitute a disability. Meanwhile, some Democratic activists have launched a criminal complaint against him in Dallas County that he's engaging in election fraud by preventing people from rightfully getting a mail ballot vote, a mail ballot for the election. So this is a mess here in Texas, and likely to continue to be in the coming months. How is this going to play out for November? I mean, can the public have confidence that they're going to be able to vote in a way that's where they feel safe, where they feel that their ballot will be counted, and in a manner that's made convenient for 16, 17 million registered voters in the state of Texas?
It's a great question. 5 states are going to use effectively all mail balloting this year. Another 28 basically are going to make it convenient for any voter who wants to vote by mail. But Texas is the most important of the 17 states that don't have this guaranteed right, except for persons that are 65 and older. Any senior can request a mail ballot automatically without excuse. All the battleground states, for example, that are in the conventional map are going to permit voting by mail this year. But Texas, not so much. We don't know. And, ultimately, I think we'll get to the Supremes. The Austin-based Supreme Court of Texas, all 9 members Republican, and the United States Supreme Court, because there's another federal lawsuit contending that making, for example, this option available only to persons of a certain age violates the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause. So I think the judges, as in Wisconsin, will end up being on the hot seat. Hopefully they'll make a decision before Election Day so that people and the people running the elections and voters will know what the hell the rules are. But right now, we don't know.
Yeah. Here locally, of course, we had a change over the weekend where our county clerk, Diane Troutman, unexpectedly announced that she was going to be resigning at the end of the month. Harris County is the largest county in the state. We have close to 2.5 million registered voters, where 15% of the state's vote. What happens here in the election is critically important. We'd foreseen possibly some of these large county election administrators here and in other places, mostly controlled by Democrats, potentially becoming adversarial with the attorney general, the governor, whoever, in terms of this mechanism of voting. But one of the things that the Bazelon article pointed out is that even if everybody's on the same page, the timing of the election is such where we only have about 5.5 months to go, that there are a lot of logistical things that need to happen in terms of printing ballots, machinery to scan them, that kind of thing, that are going to become more and more difficult to get accomplished as the clock ticks. Here in Harris County, the Commissioner's Court approved money to dramatically expand mail ballot voting to 2 million, which I think is more than anyone would anticipate we would actually need. But can we logistically pull this off, assuming that this fight between Democrats and Republicans in Texas is likely to go on for at least a few months? Even if it's resolved, are we going to have enough time to get this together for November?
Well, none of us knows because we don't know what the particular rules are going to be. But I think what's very likely to happen is there's going to be a significant increase in vote by mail, one way or the other. It's probably going to change the whole rhythm of election reporting because we're probably going to have an awful lot of ballots, not only in Texas, but across the nation. It will not be counted by 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock on November 3rd. So prepare for an election that, if it's close, may take weeks to resolve, and not because of a kind of a Florida situation, but because we simply haven't counted the votes.
Yeah, and we talked about a state like Wisconsin, I think, which typically only has about 5% of its votes cast by mail in general elections. In this most recent primary, I think it went up to 70%. And just the volume of those ballots, I mean, we're going to end up in a situation potentially like nationwide, like California, where it takes weeks to determine the final outcome in a lot of these races, because you're waiting for these ballots to trickle in over days after Election Day is passed. I mean, do you foresee that taking place here and in other states?
I do. And, we do have scanners that can read mostly these mail ballots. But as you know, you have to do a signature match with the request, the application, and the returned ballot. That's very time consuming. You have typically a representative appointed by the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and they have to look at these signatures individually. And I just don't foresee that we can get much of that done before the polls close at 7 o'clock on November 3rd. So it's something that people haven't focused on much, but we have these contentious elections, and it's not clear who's won, and the likelihood of that is much greater in 2020 because we may have 30 or 40 million votes that haven't been counted.
One encouraging thing I think that we should note is that I believe South Korea recently had a parliamentary election where they had some of the highest turnout that they've ever had. And most of the people did not vote by mail in that election. And this was taking place during the COVID pandemic in South Korea, just as we've seen around the world. And so I think they were able to put in place some processes for people voting in person that greatly reduced the likelihood of transmission of the disease. So there may be some things that we can learn from countries like South Korea, before we get to November.
Well, we got to be a little innovative. Instead of voting at Fiesta, maybe let's go across the street and vote at NRG Stadium, where you can get lots of, let's face it, folks, lots of arenas are going to be empty. Team sports with thousands of fans attending, that's quite unlikely to be the case in October, November. So we're going to have to look for some of these very large venues where we can do good spacing, avoid people lining up outside. And fortunately, in most Texas cities, we've got some facilities.
Everybody plays football here. So, I mean, you could use the high school football stadiums and maybe outdoors, but maybe that's even better if you can get the technology set up. But well, yeah, you mentioned the schools. It seems to me that that's another place where we may be able to learn from other countries in Asia and to some degree in Europe that are now getting their school systems going back in swing, and may provide some guidance for us here in the U.S. about what to do in the fall with regard to schools.
As I mentioned, we've had mostly bad news, and one element of that was that this outbreak in New York of young children getting seriously ill. It looks like it has some connection not yet determined to the virus, but at least that segment of our population that we're enormously concerned about seem to be largely spared, but not so much this week. So another thing to worry about.
Yeah. And I know we had a question that came in before we got started about polling. And I think polling, I would say, is a rich topic for discussion that I think we should maybe reserve some time in a future session to talk more in depth about. But this person was asking, are certain polls better regarded than others in terms of their quality? What polls do you look for? Do they even matter anymore in the age of Trump, where many people thought that Hillary Clinton was likely to win in 2016 based on polling? I would argue that if you looked at the state polls versus the national, they were pretty close to being right. But you want to talk a little bit generally about polling and what you look for quality?
As a now mostly retired pollster, you still see the Trump campaign, for example, which has a ton of money, just did a very extensive set of national polls in, I think, 17 states. That suggests very smart people think there's still a lot of value in polling. In terms of quality of polling, Pew is a top of the line operation. They don't do political election polls, but they do an awful lot of issue polling, and they put their stuff out at Pew Research Center. You can go online and see what they're finding. Of the media-sponsored polls, the Wall Street Journal, ABC.
I think it's NBC. They do NBC, right? Yeah.
Have generally a good reputation. Fox has a good reputation for their polling, often greatly discouraging their number one viewer, Donald John Trump. But you got to be, if you're in a hurry, just look at the averages. And particularly some polls like Rasmussen has a kind of a bad reputation until just before the election, when their polls then more or less tend to get in line with what everybody else is showing. But polls are more difficult to execute. But they still have a lot of value, as reflected in the fact that every serious campaign invests a pretty good chunk of money in this kind of data gathering.
Yeah, and I would just say I like to look at sites like Real Clear Politics and a Nate Silver's 538. They do a pretty good job of aggregating polls, which I think is always a wise course to go down. You're going to have outliers, one poll here or there that shows you a pretty dramatically different result. But if you aggregate a lot of them over time, they you tend to get that central tendency that's going to be closer to accurate. And so I would just encourage people to look at more than one and to take any individual poll with a grain of salt and look at the way things are generally moving together or not.
One thing that's specific to this year, people that look at voter participation turnout, like Michael McDonald, University of Florida, say we're going to have absolutely record turnout based on levels of public opinion interest, the election results we had in 2018 and in Virginia. But that pushes into the uncertainty about the conditions under which voting will occur. So we got a couple of wild cards in 2020. We seem to have immense public interest in the election, but in Wisconsin, a lot of people who wanted to vote actually didn't vote because it was not convenient. So we just don't know how these things are going to come together. And that makes polling even more precarious because you have to make some assumptions about who and else is going to vote. And at this point, we just don't know.
Yeah, and I think, one of the interesting things before we leave polling is just, despite everything that has happened over the last 3.5 years, two things are very interesting to me. One, as you pointed out in an interview I heard with you this morning, Donald Trump's approval and favorability has moved very little throughout the entirety of his presidency. And along with that, over the last number of months, Joe Biden has maintained a pretty consistent lead of about 6 points nationally, despite everything that's gone on, good, bad, and otherwise. Hasn't changed much. So we've got this incredibly stable views of the president and his performance, and to date, an incredibly stable presidential race, despite all kinds of extraneous factors that one would imagine might affect things.
Yeah, it looks like to me that this election is going to be about fundamentals, the most important of which is which political party do you identify with. Partisan Republicans are sticking with the president. Partisan Democrats want to get rid of him. They may have preferred somebody other than Joe Biden, and a lot of folks did, but if he's the alternative, they're sticking with Biden. So the kind of day-to-day 724 coverage about game changer, this shifted, that shifted, not so much these days. I mean, if there was ever a specific game changer, it should have been Trump's remarks in early October that were publicized just before the election with Hillary Clinton about assaulting women, and didn't really change much of anything. And these questions about Biden's conduct, I think that has virtually no impact on the larger electorate.
Yeah, and I guess the last subject I wanted to move to is, again, closer to home. Texas is a battleground. We've heard some chatter about it. My own sense is our state has not been in the forefront of the conversation lately about that, for reasons that I think I've mentioned, I think have more to do with cost and the size of our state rather than the viability of us being competitive. Talk about how the state's changed over the years and why you think it is going to be quite close in the fall, because I do too.
Well, Texas has changed immensely just since 2010. We've added between 3 and 4 million people. Some of that is natural increase from within the state, but natural increase tends to be among racial and ethnic minorities, Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans. They're not particularly fond of Donald Trump and the presidency. Internal migration from within the United States used to come to Texas from states like Louisiana, where I grew up. Now it's from California and New York. So the in-migration of persons from within the United States is very different than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And that will continue to be the case with the shrinkage of the energy sector. Lastly, here in Harris County, 42% of our growth since 2010 is of persons born outside the United States. Nationally, about 15% of Americans are born outside the United States. Locally, it's 25%. That's why Donald Trump's big bet on running hard on an anti-immigrant program, including legal immigration, is a very high-risk strategy in Texas, because most visibly locally, Fort Bend County, which was a solid Republican county, Mitt Romney won it handily. Trump lost it. Ted Cruz lost it. A lot of that is the Latino vote growing somewhat, but it's also the Asian voters that have become a swing vote in that county and have swung against Republicans. So a whole bunch of factors are at work here that make the state a lot more competitive. And my experience of watching political change is it's almost always underestimated. That the change, when it occurs, happens much more rapidly than most prognosticators imagine. Hardly anybody in California was saying in 1994 or 1995, the state's about to go blue. And then poof, it did very quickly. A lot of people in Texas were still thinking in the early 90s, the Democrats are going to hang in there and be a competitive party, until all of a sudden they weren't. And the Republicans were dominant. So when change happens, it can come very quickly, particularly in a dynamic state like Texas with a lot of people moving in, many more racial and ethnic minorities, vote increasingly in the big metro counties. So we're in play.
And I guess just to follow up on that, do you think that we're in play even if significant outside resources don't come into the state? Meaning the Biden campaign decides not to invest here, meaning Michael Bloomberg, for example, if he were to decide whatever kinds of investments he's planning on making for the fall, if he decides to pass on Texas, and if, say, the U.S. Senate race, which I think there's no reason shouldn't be competitive if there's not substantial investment in that race on both sides, do you think that change is still possible? You think it's less likely, or do you think it doesn't matter?
Well, it matters too much, because if one side starts investing a lot in Texas, the other side will counter. Republicans would rather not have to spend a lot of money in Texas because they're going to be stretched. They're playing defense almost everywhere. They talk about maybe winning Minnesota and New Mexico, states that Hillary Clinton won. Most people think that's a fantasy, not going to happen. The play is, can they hold the states they won, not win any new ones?
Yeah.
And if you drain off resources to Texas, that's going to leave you vulnerable in North Carolina, in Georgia, Arizona, states that shouldn't be in play but are.
I think that's right. And I think, another reason I think like things are likely to be competitive is because the one place where we pretty clearly are going to see investment are in these battleground congressional and state legislative races in Texas, all of which are concentrated in the big metro suburbs. And we've already seen, 6 or 8 congressional candidates on the Democratic side are mounting credible campaigns against Republican incumbents or for open seats. We've got, as many as 20 or so Texas House seats that are going to be contested that I think at least to some degree are going to be funded. And so that combination, where that spend is happening is where the fight is in this state. Republicans have taken rural Texas. It's theirs. It's not going back anytime soon. The Democrats have taken the big cities in the state. The fight is in the suburbs. And those down ballot races for Congress and the legislature will be highly contested and well funded, is my suspicion.
Yeah, I think so. The Democrats have some advantages in the House race because investors who want to be with the party that's going to control the House realize very likely it's going to be the Democrats running this show again. That makes it tough for good candidates like Wesley Hunt, who's a quality candidate the Republicans recruited to run against Lizzie Fletcher. But if it looks like the Democrats are going to be running the House, why make a major investment in a guy that would be joining a minority? We're going to have a lot of competitive local races. And when people are really worried and concerned, they're going to be more active, and that includes more funding for candidates generally.
And just lastly, so if you were to pick a county in Texas that's result in November might shock the conventional wisdom about what people expect, where might that be?
North of Dallas. Collin County is our biggest suburban county, has about 1 million residents. It went heavily Republican in the late 1980s. Lloyd Bentsen was the last Democrat that won the county. Beto came pretty close. It looks a lot to me like Fort Bend It's the second largest Asian population, growing fast. The Anglo population is stable. Again, if Collin County doesn't vote Republican, that's a shocker.
Yeah.
Because that means you're not only losing Dallas County, which is a lost cause, it's a very heavily Democratic county, but the biggest suburban county. That means you're going to get a huge metropolitan area vote. It's not enough for the Democrats to win these core counties, Harris and Travis and Dallas. That's not enough. They've got to win a lot more in the suburbs.
It's going to be fascinating to watch.
Yep.
Okay, well, I think that's going to wrap us up for today. I know we had a little bit of technical bouncing around, but I think it was okay. Thanks, Dad, for joining us, and thanks, everyone, for participating, and wish everybody the best in another week of the new normal, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.